All right, good evening everyone, and welcome to Nostra Aetate at 60 here at LMU. It's wonderful to see so many members of our campus community and friends from beyond LMU gathered here tonight to celebrate this important 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, a document that continues to shape our shared commitment to interfaith friendship, mutual respect, and the pursuit of peace. When the Second Vatican Council promulgated Nostra Aetate on October 28, 1965, it marked a profound turning point in the Church's relationship with people of other faiths. It called Catholics and people of goodwill to reject prejudice, to recognize the light of truth present in other religious traditions, and to affirm the shared dignity of every human being. 60 years later, its message of dialogue and reconciliation remains as urgent and inspiring as ever. Tonight, we have the privilege of reflecting on that legacy and exploring its continuing call in our time. We're honored to welcome the Right Reverend Alexei Smith, ecumenical and interreligious officer of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and a longtime leader and bridge builder in interfaith relations here in Southern California and in the nation. And our very own Dr. Amir Hussain, professor of theological studies here at LMU and distinguished scholar of world religions, will be moderating tonight's conversation. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment just to express our gratitude, our heartfelt gratitude to our sponsors who made this evening possible. The CSJ Center for Reconciliation and Justice here at LMU, the Jesuit Community here at LMU, and campus ministry here at LMU. Let's give our sponsors a round of applause. This ongoing dedication to dialogue, justice, and community embodies the very spirit of Nostra Aetate and makes gatherings like this possible here at LMU. We're grateful for this partnership. And I think, as a side note, it's really important for our students to reflect on these important anniversaries and these important documents in our faith traditions that call us to dialogue, that call us to greater understanding and mutual respect. And I'm grateful for campus ministry's commitment to sharing that legacy in partnership with our colleagues across the university here at LMU with our students. It's important for us not to forget this history, but to reflect on it and to apply it today. So we hope tonight's discussion will deepen our understanding of one another, strengthen our shared pursuit of peace, and renew our commitment to building bridges across our faith traditions. So please join me in welcoming Father Alexei Smith and Dr. Amir Hussain.
Thank you. Good evening all, and thanks to Kinan for that kind introduction. Before we start, as you can probably tell, Father Alexei is a California beach boy. Was born in Los Angeles. I grew up in Toronto. You may have heard there's a baseball game.
There's a certain series going on right now.
What's the score? Still 4-4. Okay, so just let us know one way or the other if good will conquer evil or if the righteous suffer. So,
Amir, we're here to dialogue.
It's a delight to be here, and I was saying to Father Alexei that I wouldn't be here were it not for Nostra Aetate, and he said he wouldn't either. And so I wonder, Father Alexei, if you could start a little bit, because there are folks that may not know Nostra Aetate, the In Our Time document that St. Pope John the 23rd sort of set in motion. So can you talk a little bit about Second Vatican Council, because people may hear, students may know like Vatican II but not know what that is, or Nostra Aetate, and give us a little background on
Sure,
this.
be happy to. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for the kind invitation to be here this evening. Of the Church's 16 major documents that were issued at the Second Vatican Council from 1960 to 1965, of those 16 major documents, by far, at least in my opinion, the most revolutionary is the one we're considering tonight, Nostra Aetate. It's the shortest of any of those church documents, but it is so significant for a number of reasons. First of all, it completely reoriented Catholic thinking towards members of non-Christian faiths. Secondly, it contains within the document only the second time in the history of the Catholic Church, the word dialogue. 1960 to 65, the church began 2,000 years ago? Come on. Why? Because up to this point, we weren't interested in dialogue. We thought we were the sole possessors of the truth. Everyone else had deviated from the truth in one way or another. And then, thanks be to God, when Pope John XXIII summoned the Second Vatican Council, one of the things he wished the council to deal with was what he termed the Jewish question. Why? Remember, this is 1960, a few years, 20 years or so after the Second World War. What was the great religious conflict in the Second World War? The Holocaust. What would be Catholic culpability, if any, in that? What did our teachings do to lead up to that, to inspire that in some way? John XXIII wanted those questions answered. And so the genesis for Nostra Aetate was that it was to be a document on the Catholic Church's relations with the Jews. And a French historian, Jules Isaac, a French Jew, somehow met with Pope John XXIII and begged him to reform Catholic teaching regarding the Jews. And John XXIII then turned this all over to Cardinal Augustin Bea, a Jesuit, and he then did a series of drafts and hearings and everything else. And after much dialogue and friction, actually, within the bishops of the council, this document was amended and expanded to include not only our relationship with the Jews, which we'll be really looking at next week at another such gathering like this, but also with Muslims and with Hindus and Buddhists, and by extension then all non-Christian religions. In this document, the Catholic Church acknowledges, and this was a major acknowledgement for us, that there is truth in non-Christian religions. That alone speaks volumes.
And I think Kenan had mentioned that, we're literally a day from the 60th anniversary. The document came out October 28, 1965. It's a really interesting time because today, October 27th, is the 7th anniversary of the shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And so when we talk about sort of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish violence, yeah, there's the Holocaust, but it continues to say, as someone who's a scholar of Islam and Muslims, I always have to remind my Muslim students that in the United States, the group that gets the most religious violence is not Muslims, it's actually Jews. And you think about that. So can you say a little bit more about, the church's relationship with the Jews post Nostra Aetate over the last, 60 years? Because I think this document really was revolutionary in that regard.
Yeah, a rabbi friend of mine once described the section on the Jews, section 4 of the document, which is the largest section of the document, as a Copernican revolution, completely reorienting, completely overturning our teachings regarding the Jews. It removes, or puts to rest, I should say, the charge of deicide. What's that? That means we don't teach that the Jews collectively, either Jews before the time of Christ, during the time of Christ, or certainly after the time of Christ, are responsible for the death of Christ. The document goes on then to note the Pauline approach to the Jews in his letter to the Romans, where he describes us, the Gentiles, as wild shoots being grafted onto the stem, which is Judaism. Catholicism, Christianity comes from the Jews. We have to acknowledge that. I have a friend who teaches at Georgetown University, teaches kind of an interreligious class. He began class by writing on, you don't do blackboards anymore, but whiteboards or whatever. He said, Christ was a Jew. And a young woman in the course stood up and he said, no, he wasn't. He was a Christian. Well, there's a phenomenal ignorance here that has to be dealt with. And that's exactly what John the 23rd wanted to take place. The section on the Jews also deplores any act of anti-Semitism or hatred towards the Jews for any reason by anyone at any time.
Some of you were here when this happened. I think it was 2008 when we had Elie Wiesel come to LMU and spoke at Gersten Pavilion. And that was when Mike Yang, Jesuit, and by the way, thank you for mentioning that Cardinal Bea was a Jesuit because in a
Jesuit school,
we have to mention at least one Jesuit, otherwise Tom will take notes and report back. No, just this idea that, sorry, I lost my train of thought there with the, what was I, the senior moment about the Jesuits. I was talking about, Elie Wiesel, sorry, thank you, yeah. It's what happens when you get old. So here's Elie Wiesel, and he comes on stage when Mike Yang, who is our dean then of the BCLA, Jesuit priest, Bob Lawton, our president then, our last Jesuit president, Jesuit priest. And here's Elie Wiesel literally standing in between two Jesuit priests who are in uniform, you know, with the collars. And the first words out of Elie Wiesel's mouth were something like, I gotta tell you, I'm a little scared, you know, standing between two Catholic priests. Because when I was a boy growing up, Jewish boys had nothing to do with Catholic priests. And for our students, and again, this was 2000, I think it was 2008, it was a watershed moment because for our students, that was that moment where they realized, oh, it's not always been like it is in Los Angeles, which is the largest Catholic archdiocese in America, one of the second largest Jewish community in America after New York City. Really good relationships there. You mentioned this work you're doing next week with the American Jewish Committee, looking at some of those kinds of things. But this idea that that's a relatively new sort of thing.
Yeah, I had a similar experience that you described. In the Jewish community here in Los Angeles, when the Roman Catholics built their new cathedral down on Temple Street, the Jewish community raised the funds and built a fountain on the plaza there. The stone came from Jerusalem, all these other things. And when that fountain was the fountain is to celebrate that relationship that we have with the Jewish community here. And when it was dedicated, the rabbi from the Skirball Center stood between Cardinal Mahoney on one side and myself on the other. And he said the same thing. As a kid, he would have never thought that he would be standing between two guys dressed like this on the cathedral plaza. It just wasn't done. Just wasn't done. And I can't tell you how many times when I've spoken at Jewish synagogues, almost inevitably, a person will come from the synagogue and take me aside and say, you know, when I was a kid and I would go past one of your schools and the nun would be sitting there or standing there, or the priest would be standing there in the play yard, and the kids would come up and say, there goes a Christ killer. You people did nothing to stop them. That was the mentality that Nostra Aetate completely overturns. Now, I'm not going to sit here and very naively tell you that mentality is totally extinguished, but it's something to work on. It continues to be worked on.
No, I think that document is so powerful. And we were talking before we came in about these words that again, for our students, they may not know these words, ecumenical versus interreligious. And can you say a little bit about your background? Because people might be aware of the fact that, you know, I'm a Muslim and I wouldn't have been teaching here if it were not for Nostra Aetate. Why would you need a Muslim teaching about Islam at a Catholic Jesuit university? Well, post-Vatican II, you do, and we'll say more about that in a minute. But you don't come from a Roman Catholic background. The fact that, you know, that there's a diversity within the Catholic tradition. So maybe it's a couple of things about the diversity within the Catholic tradition, and then ecumenical versus interreligious.
My title, if you will, with the Archdiocese, I'm the ecumenical and interreligious officer of the Archdiocese. What does that mean? I've been asking myself that ever since I took the position. By the way, next Saturday, the 1st of November, I begin my 25th year doing this. So you could say I have some experience in this area. First of all, the Catholic Church doesn't use those terms interchangeably. When we talk about something ecumenical, we're referring to our relations with our fellow Christians. When we're talking about something interreligious, we're talking about our relationship with non-Christians. What Amir is referring to is, in fact, I'm Catholic, but I'm not Roman Catholic. Many of you may or may not be aware that the Catholic Church, and I hope not to break anyone's bubble here, the Catholic Church is more than the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Church itself is actually a communion or a union of 23 different churches, all united to Rome. I'm a Greek Catholic. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. There's not a drop of Athenian blood in me. It has everything to do with spirituality. And so there's a union of churches, if you will, within the Catholic Church that could serve perhaps as a model for a unity amongst all Christians.
No, I think that that's really extraordinary. And then the interreligious part, and again, this is something our students sometimes know, sometimes they don't know. If they've taken Professor Greenberg's class, they know this. This is the most religiously diverse city in the world. You know, it's the largest Catholic archdiocese in America. It's the second largest Jewish population in America outside of New York City. As our colleague Eric Swanson, who does Buddhism, says, it's the best place in the world to study Buddhism. You know, every single kind of Buddhist community is here, and only here. You've got South Asian populations, not in the same way that you have like in the East Coast, sort of coming to Houston. I mean, we're slowly, I say this was born in Pakistan, we're slowly migrating west, you know, so it's not as big as it is in like Chicago or Houston, but it's big here. We've got, you know, Chris Chappell in the audience who created the yoga studies program here. You think about LA, and I talk about, you know, I'm a music fan and still kick myself for not going because a friend offered me tickets to what would have been Tom Petty's last show at the Hollywood Bowl, and it was a typical, well, I'll see him next time he's around, and he's dead 3 days later. Tom Petty's funeral is held at the Lake Shrine. You know, it's one of those things like, wait, what? Tom Petty, like American rock and roll in Lake Shrine, not some big mega church, you know, kind of thing. We were talking about religion and music with someone else, and we talked about, you know, and Professor Harris may actually remember the date, you know, when Aretha Franklin came back to LA to do her gospel record and recorded it live here in LA. And so you think about, yeah, the interreligious ecumenical aspect in LA is extraordinary.
Absolutely right. We have absolutely every religion here. And it's incumbent upon us, because of Nostra Aetate, to have some type of relationship with all of them. And just again, you referred to the population here. There are 5 million Catholics, 4.8 million that we know of that are registered or so in our parishes, but certainly more than that who are not registered. And many of those young Catholics, when they marry, are not marrying Catholics. So we have to be prepared to minister to these young men and women. How welcome do we make their non-Catholic spouses in our churches? I myself, sometimes I probably shouldn't be, but I'm involved sometimes in Jewish Catholic weddings. I've been to Muslim Catholic weddings, Hindu Catholic weddings. Our local priests should be doing this, but they're not, they're ill prepared to do so. So they refer them to me. So I go to a lot of wedding receptions too. But it's important. I mean, we have to be, and that's one of the geniuses of Nostra Aetate. As you said, you wouldn't be in this position.
Right.
Catholic schools wouldn't be interested in hiring someone like
Right.
me. I wouldn't be in this position because that position wouldn't exist. And every diocese in the country, in the world for that matter, by canon law is supposed to have someone like me, but sadly not many do. It's, again, 60 years is a nanosecond in the history of the church. So all this will take more time to develop and to filter down to the man and woman in the pew, and that's a big challenge.
Well, and it's a fascinating kind of thing, and I'm going to say a couple of things here. So I had the great privilege of being mentored by a man named Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was like the great Canadian scholar, I would say of religion. He happened to be a scholar of Islam, So he's also a scholar of Islam, but the great Canadian scholar of religion, really, in the 20th century. And one of his last books, like Towards a World Theology, was really extraordinary because people, but by Towards a World Theology, he didn't mean like a theology for everyone. The idea was that, you know, how can a Catholic be a Catholic in a articulate sort of way without understanding that some people are not Catholic, some people are Hindu, some people are Muslim, some people are atheists, some people are Buddhist. You know, how do you make sense of this? And so we do comparative theology. We were talking earlier about, again, another Jesuit, Frank Clooney at Harvard, extraordinary sort of comparative theologian. And oftentimes here, when I say here, I don't mean at LMU, I mean in North America, we often hear this argument that, oh, well, yeah, we'd love to do that kind of work, but we really don't have time. We have to do systematics, we have to do historical theology, we have to do, you know, such and such and such and such. Again, looking at the Jesuits, about a quarter of the Jesuits, I believe, are Indian, you know, from India. I think about another quarter are African Jesuits, you know, so about half the Jesuits in the world are either from India or from Africa, where comparative theology, comparative religion is not a luxury, it's a necessity. You know, Christians are what, like 2% of India? You know, you look at Africa and every African that I know, and I'm just trying to, in my head, do the count of the Africans I know, you know, you may be an African Christian, meaning Protestant or Catholic, you may be traditional African religion, you may be an African Muslim, but in your family, you've got those folks. Like, so literally, it's an exercise sitting at the family table of doing interfaith work. Like, you don't have that understanding that, oh, this is all a luxury, as it is sometimes here or in places where, yeah, the Catholic neighborhood was there, or forget the Catholic neighborhood. We were talking about earlier about one of the great Jesuits, and I'll say more about him in a second, who just passed away last month, Father Pat Ryan from Fordham, extraordinary Jesuit doing Muslim-Catholic dialogue. He came from like this 2-block Irish Catholic ghetto, you know, and the exotic other across the street was the Italian Catholic ghetto. So forget about, you know, any kind of Catholic. Like, it was the Irish Catholics versus the Italian Catholics, the Protestants, the Jews. That was a completely different
That's right.
world.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. These are all very important points. I think that it's also important to note that Nostra Aetate calls for dialogue between the Catholic Church and non-Christian faiths, and also collaboration. Those two words appear in the document. Dialogue and collaboration. These first 60 years since Nostra Aetate, we've been fairly good with dialogues. We have a number, here in Los Angeles, we have a number of bilateral dialogues. I'm part of a number of national bilateral dialogues. What we really have to work more on is the collaboration aspect. And there's some ways of doing that. I mean, to cut you off there.
No, and I think this is, I was saying earlier that I think the last 60 years of Nostra Aetate very rightly have been, precisely as Father Alexei said, sort of repairing the Catholic Church's relationship with the Jewish communities. You know, I think the next 60 years, not that you have to stop that, you always obviously have to keep working on that. I think the next 60 years are really going to focus more on the Muslim community, because like Buddhists and Hindus are sort of mentioned briefly in Nostra Aetate, but the two groups that are really discussed are the Jewish community and the Muslim community. And again, these groundbreaking kinds of things to say, oh, Muslims and Catholics worship the same God.
Yeah. I'm not sure, but I think you were going to have texts of the document available for everyone. If not, then allow me to just share with you that the very first words of that section that deals with our relationship with Islam states, the Catholic Church also esteems highly the Muslims. Now, those of you who are Catholic, when's the last time you heard your priest tell you that? The Church highly esteems the Muslims. This is the official teaching of the Catholic Church. And it has yet really to filter down to the extent that we'd like it to filter down. I was at a nameless parish on Sunday to officiate at the Mass. And the parish very nicely was advertising this event tonight. He had my picture in the bulletin and talked about this event. And the deacon and I were talking about it in the sacristy, and he told me that someone he works with thinks that every Muslim, and that person is Catholic, at least they think they are, They think that every Muslim is automatically going to hell just because they're Muslim.
Yeah.
That's contrary to what the document says. The document highlights the fact that we believe in the same God. We, as you practice during Ramadan, prayer, fasting, zakat, charity, we do during Lent. Mary, I do a number of presentations on Mary and in Islam and in Catholicism, so, something that we share. Most of our Catholic people are unaware that there's a whole chapter in the Quran about Mary. There's more information about Mary in the Quran than there is in the Bible.
Yeah.
You know? So there's a lot of things we can build on there. Also, the document in that section on Islam, and I'm sure that part was written by someone from the Vatican Diplomatic Service, because it clearly states that in these times, it's better if we put aside the past and just move on with the future. I disagree there. I don't think we can simply put aside the past. I think we have to learn from the past and that animosity that perhaps existed and how we can overcome that and collaborate together.
Yeah. No, and those connections are so interesting. We were talking at an earlier time, and you know, we have Professor Second Hussain, who's a marvelous sort of Quran scholar who's done really, really good work on some of the things that the Quran preserves. And one of them is these really interesting things about precisely like, you know, your sort of Eastern Catholic tradition. And so, you know, Fridays at the Friday afternoon congregational prayer, one of the chapters of the Quran that Muslims are encouraged to recite is Surah Al-Kahf, the Surah of the Cave, which tells the story of the seven sleepers of Ephesus. You know, it's this really interesting sort of moment where the Quran preserves what used to be a sort of a Christian teaching. So I would wager, you know, that in the 7th century, most Christians who knew something about Christianity knew the story of the seven sleepers of Ephesus. I would wager that most Christians today, including most Catholic Christians, have no idea what I'm talking about when I say the seven sleepers of Ephesus, but this sense that the Quran preserves that. The prayer, if you look at prayer in the Quran, it's not a prayer text, but it clearly talks about standing and kneeling and bowing, and so Muslims do that. Well, that's what Christian prayer looked like in the 7th century. You know, you talk about Muslims praying 5 times a day. We've got a couple of our chairs, a medievalist, Austin Foley, medievalist, Anna Harrison's medievalist. You know, in the Middle Ages, if you prayed the hours, what's that, like 8 times a day that you prayed? You know, and so this 5 times a day is actually less than the 8 times a day that you prayed as a Christian, you know, back then. And so this idea that the religious practices of Islam are not in any way very different from the religious practices of Christianity at a particular time and place. And now it's changed. And now the Lenten fast, for example, that used to be like a fast, and it still is in the Orthodox churches, less so in the Catholic churches. Today, the prayer...
In the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah. Yeah, you know, those prayer gestures that you referred to, in the Greek Catholic world during Lent when we pray, I do the same gestures as you do. Dead silence. You know, it's amazing. We share that. The idea also of fasting. You're much better at fasting than we are. But in the Eastern Catholic world, in the Eastern Orthodox world, the fasting, the physical fasting during Lent is taken very seriously. Not as severely as you do.
No, but you basically become like a vegan, right? Like
yeah, basically you become vegan. The idea being to try to emulate Adam and Eve in paradise before the fall, that type of thing. And more importantly, their relationship that they had with God before the fall. But again, I think there's so much that our people are blissfully ignorant of, that we have so much in common.
Yeah. Well, the Jesuit that I think has done the most work with Islam and Muslims, certainly in America, is Father Tom Michel. And Tom tells this story where he's a young priest when Vatican II happens, and it's exactly those words. The church highly esteems Muslims. He's like, who knew this? Like he's in Wisconsin. There's not a lot of Muslims in Wisconsin, wants to do this kind of thing. ends up talking to his sort of superior, who sends him to, at the time, still now, the country with the most Muslims, Indonesia, to learn about Islam and Muslims. It's sort of in Indonesia, and not telling tales out of school, because Tom tells this story all the time. Like, he was a diocesan priest before he became a Jesuit. He became a Jesuit when he was in Indonesia, because that was the only way he could stay in Indonesia. Because having been in Jakarta over Christmas, he didn't particularly want to go back to Wisconsin, in December, because it's a little colder there. And so there's really interesting kinds of moments. And then the Jesuits, of course, send him to the University of Chicago to do a PhD there. The other person that I mentioned, Father Pat Ryan, goes to Harvard, does a PhD at Harvard with my mentor, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and the great scholar of Islamic mysticism in America, Anna Marie Schimmel. These extraordinary kinds of things. And then, Tom, I don't know if you remember, I think it's the 34th General Congregation, where for the Jesuits, there's this idea of, okay, well, we have to incorporate this kind of interreligious dialogue into the work that we do, especially connecting to Islam and Muslims, having, I think, like the Jesuit house in Jerusalem being like a center for not just Christian and Jewish study, but Christian, Jewish, and Muslim study. And so doing that kind of work, which then gets reciprocated, it takes time to do this. So in 2007, a number of Muslim scholars issued a document called A Common Word Between Us and You, which comes from a line in the Quran where God says to come to a common word, come to a word of agreement between different religious folks there. And that's where I first met Pat Ryan, because this document came out in 2007. I think Georgetown did a event in 2008, and Pat was there, and I was one of the speakers, and I started talking about my mentor, and you saw the look on Pat's face, and it's like the sense, okay, we have the same, mentor there, but that connection to say that, it's not just been a one-way street. It's both ways. It's now Jews, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. The Jewish community, because I know you've done a ton of work with the American Jewish Committee, but the Muslim community as well, doing that work in return. So it's not just simply Catholics talking to Muslims, but Muslims reciprocating and Jews reciprocating.
Three things. First of all, the seven sleepers of Ephesus. I've been in Turkey many times. This takes place outside of what today we would know as Ephesus.
Paul's letter to the Ephesians, that's...
Yeah, exactly. And I was there, that's where Mary's the shrine is, Mary Ammon, the place where John traditionally has taken Mary to live after Christ ascends into heaven. And not far from there, there's a cave, and there's a sign that says, the Sleepers of Ephesus Cave. And that's a story that's maintained more in Eastern Christianity of 7 martyrs who are put to death by being sealed into this cave, and then they come back back to life after centuries or something. Well, I was in a car with Muslim friends, and I saw the sign, and I must have said it out loud, 7 Sleepers of Ephesus, and they immediately started telling me the story from the Quran, and I said, just a moment, and then I finished the story from the Christian viewpoint. So again, a point of sharing. Indonesia, you may or not remember that when Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, was there. No, yeah, it was Pope Francis. He met with the chief imam. In Jakarta, the capital, the Catholic Cathedral is on one side of a plaza, the Great Mosque on the other side. There's a tunnel underneath that plaza that facilitates movement back and forth. So Muslims can come and pray in the cathedral, and Catholics can go over to the mosque. The idea was, I know this because the imam and I talked about this, was to possibly have the imam enter his side and Pope Francis on the other side, and they meet together and walk together through the tunnel. Pope Francis' health didn't allow that at the time, so they weren't able to do that. But it shows that there is developing relations there. And I forget the third one.
It'll come to you. But no, when you were saying that, it made me think about, so Joan and I were in Egypt, I think in 2008, wonderful conference that was done by Ahmed Tayyib, who at the time was sort of the rector of Al-Azhar University. So Al-Azhar is sort of one of the great centers of Sunni learning, in the Muslim world. And Sheikh Tantawi was the Sheikh al-Azhar. Well, then after Sheikh Tantawi died, Sheikh Ahmed Ataib was appointed the Sheikh al-Azhar, and then did this document, the document on human fraternity, with Pope Francis. And it's one of those things like, in my lifetime, did I think I would see the Pope write something with a Muslim leader? No. One of the nice things about being Pope is you don't need co-authors. You can do the kinds of things that you want to say.
And they get published, without co-authors, yeah. I remember the other point, a common word. You know how that document generated? Pope Benedict, in his trip to his native Germany in Regensburg, made some very, very unfortunate comments in quoting the Byzantine emperor about Islam. And didn't set well, and I understood that didn't set well. In fact, when I was at the papal ambassador's residence in Ankara, he told me that people, after Pope Benedict said those things, people sent funeral wreaths to the embassy, Vatican embassy, signifying that they thought Catholic-Muslim relations were dead. But Muslim scholars got together and wrote this wonderful document called A Common Word, where they pair, if you will, quotations from the scriptures, from the Catholic scriptures, Christian scriptures, and from the Quran. It's a wonderful text. I think we had a golden opportunity there, here in Los Angeles anyway, and we missed that. And where we didn't use that document to partner Catholic churches and mosques together in study groups, using that document.
Yeah. No, it's a great text, and then, for lots of different reasons, not the least of which is, among the people that signed it were people that wouldn't be in the same room with each other. I mean, it says ecumenical, using the Muslim understanding, there, of all the different kinds of Muslim groups.
You have the same challenges that we have with...
Right. Certain people that probably wouldn't be in the same room with certain other people were there to sign. They weren't in the same room, but they signed the document there. But this idea that, the two great commandments in both Catholicism and Islam are the same two great commandments. You know this as Catholics, when Jesus is asked, what's the great commandment? What's he say? But as a good Jewish boy, he recites the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. My Hebrew isn't great, but that sounds very much to my ears like the Arabic. Qul huwa Allahu ahad, say God is one. So what do you say as the great commandment? Well, God and the love of God. What's the second commandment? Love your neighbor. Surprise, surprise, surprise. For Muslims, what's the great commandment? Tawheed, oneness, the absolute utter oneness of God and loving God. What's the second thing? Love your neighbor. And so, which seems so basic, and yet the fact that you have to say these basic kinds of things because so many folks don't understand those basic kinds of things.
When I was at another Jesuit university, Georgetown, 10 years ago, when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of this document, the then prefect of the president of the pontifical, then called Council for Interreligious Dialogue, the late Cardinal Toran, who was a wonderful man, he said precisely that. What really binds us together, the foundation, is those two items that we share together: belief in the one God and that oneness of loving the neighbor.
Yeah. No, and that's, again, one of those really interesting kinds of things, because it doesn't mean that we're the same in any kind of way. And you talk about, Christology and Jesus and the notion that, your understanding of Jesus as a Catholic is very different than my understanding of Jesus as a Muslim.
As a prophet,
right, as a prophet. But then you talk about Mary, and sort of, whenever I say to people, I'm a Muslim Guadalupano, wait, what did he say? We know what Guadalupano is, a devotee of Our Lady of Guadalupe, but how can you be a Muslim? And I'm like, how can I not? This is you come to my office, it's this funny kind of thing. I think I haven't counted, but I've counted in my office. I have 9 statues of Mary. I don't think anyone else has as many statues of Mary in their office as I do. And my ritual coming in is lighting a candle.
I don't. Yeah.
Right? No. But it's this kind of, those sorts of connections there. Doesn't mean that it's the same,
No.
But you have these really interesting sorts of connections, and I think that's so crucial. That's so important.
Yeah, another point of connection is on the environmental issues. Pope Francis, the wonderful encyclical Laudato Si, and now Muslim scholars have issued a similar document, El Azhar, I believe it's called. And that's actually, those two documents are being studied on the national level of our Muslim Catholic dialogue. And again, that's wonderful on that level, but it has to filter down too.
Right. And speaking for John, I know we want to throw it open to questions and comments and reactions from you who've been very patiently sitting here. But I think, again, for me, this is one of those really nice kinds of things. Like you look at the changes. And so those of you that knew the late Pope Francis knew that, when he was in Argentina, was friends with Rabbi Abraham Skorka. And we had Rabbi Skorka come to LMU and give a talk here. And so, again, that's relatively new in the Catholic world to have a pope who has Jewish friends, who has these kinds of connections. What's been really interesting with the current Pope, Pope Leo, is, and I'm smiling as I say this because part of his education was a Catholic Theological Union. He's done work with Scott Alexander on Islam. And so it's he's the first pope that I can say has, I know he's taken a class on Islam at Catholic Theological Union. Most popes don't take courses on Islam. That's just not required in the job description,
Exactly. I think that Pope Francis certainly broadened our relationship with Muslims and with other religions as well. I remember being privileged to be with him twice on interreligious things. And I remember with the Buddhists, we had been together all week in this dialogue of eternity. And then we were to have this audience with Pope Francis, and we were to share with him what we had decided to do. We had to move beyond theological studies and to embrace something practical, some social justice issue that we could work on together. So we took the idea, two different ideas for Los Angeles here. We were going to work on jointly implementing Laudato Si at that time, and also trying to work together to alleviate the suffering of the homeless here. One of the great aspects of Buddhism is compassion. And so what we were able there to do was to partner our St. Vincent de Paul Society with the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, and they've done some wonderful work together. And I remember Pope Francis, the Buddhists all brought gifts. Catholics didn't, but the Buddhists all brought gifts. And the one young lady who was a Tibetan Buddhist was so nervous at meeting Pope Francis that she forgot to give the gift. And so then we were about to leave, and she came running up, to give him the gift. Of course, the Swiss Guard and the Monsignori don't like anyone running towards the Pope. So they stopped her, and he said, no, let her come. And then they tried to explain, she wants to put a Buddhist prayer shawl on you. And he looked at them and said, and so? So he bent his neck and allowed her to put that Buddhist prayer shawl on him. It was a wonderful gesture. And gestures speak volumes. Back to the Jews for just a moment. Perhaps the greatest honor I think that's been bestowed upon me in these last 24, 25 years is that I've been asked to speak at the funerals of 3 rabbis. That would not have happened without Nostra Aetate.
Yeah. No, and I know Kenan wants to move Mike around and ask questions here, but it's what is the church called? The dialogue of life. This idea that it's not just this academic intellectual exercise that those of us who are in the academy do. It's how do you live together, and that's really crucial. And your point about actions speaking louder than words. I was obviously here, when Pope Francis became the Pope, and I think it was the first Easter that he was Pope, and he washed the feet of the Muslim woman prisoner. And I'm like, oh, I've never seen a pope wash the feet of a Muslim woman before. Most popes don't do that.
We hadn't either.
But that spoke volumes in the Muslim world. Right. 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 So, Kenan, did you have a microphone there to pass around? So if folks have questions, comments, things they'd like to ask here. So, Kenan will pass the mic around. So there's someone in the back first.
Hello. Hi. I I'm curious about the level of official recognition a Muslim is allowed to have of the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Are there any restrictions on that, or it's a curious thing?
Yeah. So, and all I can say about it, my Muslim point of view may be a heretical Muslim point of view here, but I don't think it is. What I mean by that is if you go to places, so it's sort of fascinating, Father Alexei talked about the House of Mary in Turkey, in Ephesus, It's not just Catholics or Christians that go there, there's Muslims that go there. If you go to places where you have Marian apparitions, so Lourdes, for example, one of the most famous, you'll see Muslims, particularly Muslim women, that are there, because this is important. And so you can see the smile on my face. So about, would have been 2012, I think it was. I was invited to go to Ohio. Professor Foley's from Ohio, invited by the Franciscans to do some work because they were planning for 2019. 2019 was the 800th anniversary of the encounter between the founder of the Franciscans, St. Francis, and the Muslim Sultan at the time, Malik al-Kamil, in the Fifth Crusade in the year 1219. And so they wanted me to help them with some of that work there, and I did that. That's where I got to know Brother Robert Lentz, this fabulous Franciscan icon writer. And he's done these marvelous icons of Middle Eastern holiness, like, the Syrophoenician woman, figures that you don't tend to see as with icons, there. Right. And so I asked him to do, would he consider writing an icon of Mary? And we were friends at that point. He says, well, no, I can't really do that for you because, what you're asking for is like a Muslim Mary, and I'm a Franciscan, I'm a Catholic. I can't do like a Muslim Mary. Like, oh, no, sorry, I wasn't very clear on what I was saying. It's like, so we talk about the Virgin Mary appearing in different places, in different times, to different people. What if, just thinking out loud here, the Quranic text about Mary is an apparition of the Virgin, not in, personal form, but in this textual form? He's like, ooh, that's intriguing. Now, that's probably just as heretical to Catholics as it is to Muslims here. But I think so all I can speak about to your question, for me, it's that sense of, sorry, I will not say this in when I say these words, please don't take offense to them. I'm a deeply superstitious little man. I believe in these kinds of things, in the unseen, in those kinds of things. And so this idea that Mary appears, in different places, in different times and places. My tradition has that all the time. Like, to encounter the prophet in a vision, in a dream, is the same as historically having met the prophet during the prophet's lifetime. And so those visionary kinds of experiences are given a huge authority. And so for me personally, like, this is important. Do I think that Mary appears to Juan Diego, in the hill outside next week? Yeah, I think she does, in really interesting kinds of ways. And that sort of way in which you relate. And I think for a lot of folks, there's that sense, because both within, there's no clergy in Islam, and yet the sort of people that lead the prayer tend to be overwhelmingly male. And so you look at this kind of thing and having that sort of feminine aspect there, and that relationship there, which is really interesting. Other Muslims, like, the same thing, like the sort of what we talk about loosely as the cult of the saints. A lot of Muslims, that's haram, you can't have this, we have God, you have the relationship with God. And I'm like, yeah, but it's easier to talk to that person than it is to talk to, because God's an abstract entity. I think now one of my great heroes, C.S. Lewis, the writer, who when he was young and his parents sort of tried to talk to him as God being without form, could only imagine like tapioca pudding, because that's the only thing he thought was formless. And so he thought of God as like this giant ocean of tapioca pudding, and no, that's not actually what it means. But it's not like we tend to think of those things. So long answer to your question, but I think that's the thing. And I'm not, when I say this, I'm not unique in this. Like, there are literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslims, particularly Muslim women, who will be at these Marianist apparition places.
I myself have seen that, not only at Ephesus, but certainly in Bethlehem, at the shrine of spilt milk down the road from the basilica there. Also, I know that in Lebanon and in places in Syria, Catholic Marian shrines are often frequented by Muslims, particularly Muslim women, also seeking Mary's intercession, if you will, to use a Catholic term, to have a child.
And this may well be a South Asian thing too, because that's the thing. I was born in Lahore, which is in the Punjab. It used to be part of India. Then after independence and partition, it becomes part of Pakistan. But you would go to a shrine and you wouldn't know if the shrine was like a Hindu saint or a Muslim saint or a Sikh saint. It was just, this is a holy person. And you literally didn't ask the question of whose holy person is this? Because holy people are holy people. There's not, and I'm doing this because it's that, the Arabic term baraka, blessing, is very much like it's a tangible, you can get, why did Catholics have relics? Well, because, the touch, you can touch this. You can get the holiness. Right, yeah. Right. There. Yeah.
Different.
Yeah, so there's a hand up here and a hand up there. Yeah, good. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, I have two questions, and I'll try to remember the second after I ask the first. The first one is more of an observation, but you talked about a relationship between a Catholic, was it a bishop, and a Muslim, and it was shocking to see them both, or how the Muslim reacted. That reminded me, if you can recall, the assassination attempt in 1981 on Pope John Paul II. Yeah. And when he got better, he almost died, I think, he went to the Turkish man in the prison and he reached out to him. And that man, he just seemed like embarrassed. He wasn't quite sure what to do. He was just, is this guy for real? It was really funny to see that reaction. So that really left an effect. But the other thing I wanted to mention is, I think, Father Alexei, you talked about a mandate from the Vatican that we all have representatives in the cities, the diocese. So what's your impression, and this is open to both of you, what's going on in, for example, San Diego, New York, Chicago, London, Paris? Do you see an active interfaith outreach with your counterparts?
Yes, I have certainly counterparts in some of those cities you mentioned. Certainly Chicago, up until recently in San Diego, but San Diego now has a new bishop, so that might change. They might put someone there more permanently. In New York, Arlington, Virginia, various places throughout the United States. The sad part, the challenging part, is that many other cities, for example, California here, there are a number of Catholic dioceses in our state, but only Orange and Los Angeles are the only two that really have people in these positions. Other dioceses might have someone, but that person wears about 15 different hats in the archdiocese. The amount of time that they can devote to this work is minimal, and that has to change.
And there's sort of, I've been very privileged to meet a number of these people who've done this extraordinary sort of work in Muslim-Catholic dialogue. One of them, senior folks, Cardinal Michael Fitzgerald, who Joan and I first met when he was Archbishop Fitzgerald, in Egypt. Extraordinary man. One of the people that I've never met, and it's funny because I've admired him for at least a decade, was the former bishop in San Diego, Father Robert McElroy. Bishop McElroy. Well, and this is a great story. So you've got Cardinal McElroy, who is at that point, Bishop McElroy in San Diego, very outspoken about migrants and the humane treatment of migrants, because you can walk to Mexico from his diocese, there. But then he made that connection during the Syrian refugee crisis to Muslim migrants, because of course there was fear about, Syrian refugees are coming, are these going to be secret, ISIS terrorists, wherever should we take them? And Father McElroy was outspoken there. And then, Pope Francis elevated Bishop McElroy to cardinal, and then at the beginning of this year, moved him to Washington, D.C., which I think was very clearly to certain politicians in Washington, D.C., who don't have the same respect for migrants, and I would say for Muslims. And it's one of those really, I don't think you've heard this story, but it's one of these funny moments where I've admired Cardinal McElroy, never met him, but we've communicated, corresponded. When my last book came out, which is sort of an introduction to Islam for a Christian audience, I sent him a copy of the book. And about 2 weeks later, I got a beautiful sort of little handwritten card. What is it, a galero? Like what's the cardinal's a hat? You know, yeah, and on his stationery. You know, a lovely kind of thing. And then he had to go to Rome for the conclave, and it was one of these like straight out of a movie where I'm sitting at home and you're paying attention, and you get the news flash from the New York Times that white smoke has been detected. They've selected a pope, but at that point the name had been announced, and I'm thinking, I wonder who it's going to be, what's going to happen. I didn't have Cardinal Prevost in my betting pool, there. Well, and it's funny because I'm literally driving right here along LMU Drive and pulling into the underground parking that all of you that parked here, parked in, and the radio's about to go out. And it's a CBS News feed, and they're talking about, we think it's American, we think it's American. Then they go to the Italian, because it's the Vatican, and I don't speak Italian, but they were saying, and it's Cardinal Roberto, and I'm like, no, it's gonna be McElroy, and then Prevost, and I'm like, oh, okay, they picked, but for a half second there I thought, this is going to be awesome, because I actually have an endorsement from the Pope about my book. Now it's only from Cardinal McElroy, but just that kind of thing. And so back to your question, I think folks like him are just extraordinary. They're doing that kind of work. I never met Cardinal Turan, but
he
Cardinal.
Was my mentor.
Right.
My mentor. He was
Cardinal Fitzgerald is just extraordinary.
By the way, Cardinal Fitzgerald is going to be at Georgetown for like a 4-hour seminar on Catholic-Muslim relations, which is available via Zoom this week, I think, or maybe next week. I'll send the information to you. And I did have met and know Cardinal McElroy. I worked with him on Muslim-Catholic dialogue for a number of years.
Yeah. No, and it's one of those, and you would know this, is it Stanford undergrad and Harvard PhD, or Harvard PhD and Stanford undergrad? I mean, this is a very smart person.
Yeah. I think this gentleman's right. Yeah.
So I have maybe a 3-part. Just let me get it out. What are the key pillars that were used to make such a dramatic change regarding Christ killer to what I'm imagining the document to say? Second part,
Let's do one at a time.
Okay, cool, perfect.
Yes, I think first of all, the Holy Spirit must have inspired these bishops, because when the final text was voted upon, it was an overwhelming positive vote, like 2,202 votes against 88 no and 2 abstentions. So that showed, in my mind, the Holy Spirit alive and well, and inspired these men to say, yes, we have to do something, particularly at the main focus, at least initially, with the Jewish community because of the Holocaust.
Right. Well, and then just not to jump into this, but jump into this, that, that as a scholar of religion, not as a Christian or a Catholic, you point out very clearly that, well, look, crucifixion is not a Jewish punishment. No. It's a Roman punishment. It's the Jews didn't do this. It's not a Jewish punishment.
Yeah. And sadly, that mentality of Christ killers still exists. Right. And many, I don't know how many, but in certain segments. We have a kind of a religious ed program at our parish, or we had for a number of years. We opened up to the neighborhood, and one little kid from the neighborhood came and participated, and we were reading something, and the term Jews was mentioned. And this little kid puts up his hand, now, Father, the Jews, they're the ones that killed Jesus, right? Wow. In this day and age, somehow this child has been taught that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. So this is what we have to counter.
So I think Professor Hussain hit it right on there about it's not Jewish, it was a Roman crucifixion. Yeah, so then the other thing about dialogue. You mentioned that we've been being good about dialogue, but you also mentioned that we should go in the direction of collaborations. Would you speak to that? Could you give us some like vision?
Sure. I don't think, for example, the homeless situation. I don't see any reason why the Catholic charities should be doing their things, and Lutheran charities should be doing their things, and Muslim mosques should be doing their things, and Jewish life services should be doing their things. Why can't we do these things together? Why can't we collaborate and try to bring some real help to these people as well?
Well, and that was just to chime in on that, when you mentioned it the first time, I forgot to mention, we lost again, one of these great pillars in the Los Angeles Muslim community a month or so ago, Omar Hakim Bey.
Yeah.
So Omar Hakim was an extraordinary sort of Muslim leader, and one of the things he did was create Humanitarian Day, which is again that kind of day of service for Muslims in South Central LA. Without getting too far into the picture of Islam and Muslims, that's not what we're here for. American Muslims are this really sort of interesting group where about 30% of us are people like me. By that I don't mean South Asian, although about 30% of us are South Asian. I mean people who are professionals with at least an undergraduate degree, if not a graduate or professional degree, who make well over $100,000 a year. 40% of us American Muslims live below the poverty level. We don't think about that. When we think about American Muslims, do you think of, your cardiologist, the engineer, the doctor, the business owner, or do you think about, the underpaid day laborer, that kind of thing there? And so for Omar to say, yeah, no. We have to have, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, within the community, within Muslims. And that's one part. The other part, one of the great American Muslim organizations in LA is the Ummah Clinic. So Ummah is an Arabic term that means, mother, family, and Muslims use that in the same way that Catholics use the term church. The Ummah is the community there. In this case, it's an acronym, University Muslim Medical Association, started by Muslim doctors, serving almost exclusively, I think like 95% of their patients are low-income folks who are not Muslim, and this idea
Many
that
Catholics.
well, exactly, but this idea that no, it's our duty as Muslims to provide services, including, if we're physicians, healthcare. So let's do this kind of work and to collaborate. I mean, they took over. It must have been 15 years ago, like Fremont High School. I'm 6'2" and not afraid of anything. I would be afraid to go into Fremont High School, back then. And then, the kind of work they were able to do and establish the kind of, the community garden, the healthy eating, like these horrific kinds of rates of kids with like pre-diabetes and things like that. Joan sees this all the time where, you've got a kid where, I can buy like a 30 case of Coke at Costco and a 30 pack of Doritos and give my kid a Coke and a Doritos, for lunch, because that's the cheapest lunch I can give them. No, it's not the best lunch to give your kid, and do that. And so, how do you create healthy eating habits? What do you do? That kind of stuff. And those are the kinds of things which often go under the radar. We don't talk about, most of you probably haven't heard of the Ummah Clinic. Most of you probably haven't heard of Omar Hakim and Humanitarian Day. And I'm talking about Muslims. I don't mean, those of you who are Christians. Yeah.
Just one other comment about the clinic. Some years ago, I was there, and Irish Catholic young guy, doctor, was working there, and he came up to me and he said, I had an opportunity to work at like Torrance Memorial or one of these big hospitals in South Bay, but I prefer to come and work here because we can collaborate with one another.
Thank you. Well, my final part has to do with, as I'm hearing you saying that the theological community is beginning to understand that the God of Abraham is the God of the Christian Muslims and the Jews.
Yes.
So, I heard you kind of just breathe over a little thing where it said about the animosity, putting aside the animosity. I was wondering, do you have any idea what technology or spiritual guidance we can have to actually get to this place where we can put aside the animosity and bring the family back together? Can you speak to me on that?
Well, technology is both good and less good, right? Depends on who and how it's used.
And it can be spiritual technology.
Yes, exactly. I think that certainly is one of the emphases that we share, Muslims and Catholics and Jews for that matter, and Buddhists and Hindus, everyone else, the idea of family as a basic social unit. And we should be able to to concentrate on that. I'll give you an example. I don't do it so much anymore, but I used to do these Father Alexei bus tours, where we would go on tours of different houses of worship. Not just to look at buildings, but to encounter people actually worshiping there. And I took a group, and one of the stops we made was to the Omar Ibn al-Khattab Foundation down by USC. And I explained to people, you know, ladies are going to have to cover your hair and all this other stuff out of respect. And this one woman grabbed me as she got off the bus, and she said, "I'm so happy you brought us here." And I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Because I live down the street and I've always wanted to come in here." I said, "And you haven't?" And she said, "No, I've never come in here." "Why haven't you?" And she hemmed and hawed and she said, "Because I'm afraid of them." So I said, "Okay, we're going to go in here. We're going to be here for a service. You're as a woman, and I'm a man. We're going to have to sit separately. But one of my eyes will be on you. And if any time you feel uncomfortable, you just let me know, and I'll come over and get you, and we'll go out." So she stayed, and afterwards the ladies were all talking together. Got time to get on the bus to go home, to go to the next stop rather. And good tour guide account, one person's missing. Who is it? That woman. And what is she doing? She's talking about family issues with a Muslim woman who have the same issues that she's having.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
So we have to break down barriers.
Yes. Thank you. Appreciate that.
I think one problem here in Los Angeles area is the Archdiocese collaborates with a number of media sources that promote a false narrative of what you've been discussing here this evening. And I think a good example is Relevant Radio that really demeans Muslims, basically says they're jihadists. Another one is Sophia Institute that produces Crisis Magazine. And I just wonder, maybe by your leadership, both of you, you might be an influence to encourage the Archdiocese to sort of distance themselves from these kinds of media sources.
I have full confession, Catholics are into confession. I confess that I listen occasionally, more than occasionally, to Relevant Radio just to hear what they're saying. And I agree with you, some of the things they say, not just about Muslims, but about other faiths, are very jarring at times. And I have pointed this out to some of our archdiocese officials, but that hasn't gone any further than that. But that's not a sign that it can't go further than that. Because it negates everything that Nostra Aetate is standing for.
Oh, thank you. And maybe walk over. Thank you for this. So I have a question about, and maybe it's completely irrelevant, so you can just say, we're not going to talk about that. But as you're talking, I was just retired from being an elementary school teacher, and when you teach fourth grade in California, you teach about the mission system and all of that. And of course, over the years, so many students don't have an understanding that Catholics are Christians. Like this conversation I used to have all the time. I'm like, I'm not teaching you religion, but like we have to understand this. So then the question becomes, I don't hear, is there an assumption that Protestants already have an ongoing conversation with Catholics and therefore they are not a part of that document or anything else, or?
No, there's a separate document. You know, I said initially this evening that we don't use those terms interchangeably, ecumenical and interreligious. Ecumenical means with our fellow Christians. There is a separate document that deals with our relationships with our fellow Christians. And that basic document also points out that you don't have to be Catholic to be saved, that type of thing, you know? And wow, yes, that's that. And that calling for dialogue and cooperation and such there. Also, the Archdiocese has a, what do they call that? An agreement, if you will, between the Lutherans here, the Episcopal Church, and the Catholics, which we're supposed to be implementing in each of our parishes. Again, collaborating and working together, almost virtually ignored, but I still try to point it out all the time.
say thank you all so much for this. Back at the beginning when you were talking about the use of the word dialogue, is it in that first, wait, you said that this was the second time it was used. What was the first?
The first time was in the document on ecumenism.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
I know that we're getting close to time. It's almost 9 o'clock, and we have some refreshments that I want everyone to enjoy. But maybe on a sort of hopeful note, we've talked a little bit about how these dialogues exist at the international level, the national level, but often they're missing at the local level. We've seen in the Muslim community, not a lot of folks know about the Common Word document that Muslim scholars have issued. We see similar things in the Catholic community. Not everyone knows about Nostra Aetate. But thinking very locally here, we're at LMU, a university. How can students start to think about dialogue more intentionally and maybe utilize these documents in that work?
I think we can do it in so many ways, and it goes back to what the church calls the dialogue of life. And so if you look at, the Jesuit apostolic preferences, one of them about care for our common home, that's Laudato Si, but that's the Muslim kind of thing. And so this idea that, you can do this kind of work, which you might do from a purely, when I say scientific, I mean like not rooted in a religious thing. Like, yes, it's a good idea to clean up the environment. You don't need to be, you can be an atheist and say it's a good idea to clean up the environment. But if you come from a religious community that says, no, this is part of what you're commanded to do because you're given the earth in trust, and what does that mean? So that kind of work. Or in a very different kind of way, like with our Center for Service and Action, exactly that kind of moment. Like my first foray into interfaith as an undergraduate had nothing to do with theological concepts. It was about feeding the hungry. This was the 1980s in Toronto. The food bank movement was just starting, and there was a huge debate about, should we do this? Because if we do this, does this take the government off the hook? Shouldn't the government be sorry, in Canada, government, it seems a good thing. It's not a bad thing here. Like, shouldn't the government be responsible for feeding citizens? But if the government isn't, maybe it's up to folks who have a religious perspective doing this. That's no different than what our Center for Service and Action does. And so I think there's so many different ways, whether it's we have so many wonderful professors in our theology department that do these really great kinds of courses, this sort of work, but oftentimes it's literally the dialogue of life. It's literally the Catholic student who's paired for the first time in the dorm with a Jewish student or a Muslim student or a Protestant student who literally has that. So what do you do? Why do you do this? Why do you have that on the wall? Why are you doing this on Sunday or Friday? And those kinds of conversations that, I'm smiling as I say this because as an academic, I always used to think that the most important 3 hours for students were the 3 hours that they were in my class, not anyone else's class. I mean, my class was the most. But then you realize with some humility that, oh, right, they're not in my class for like 165, or I'm not a math guy, whatever 24 times 7 minus 3 is, that number. And then you go back to your own things undergrad, like the most meaningful conversations I had were in the dorm room over pizza at 2 a.m. Like those are the ways in which you engage, those are the ways in which you learn. And we have so many opportunities to do that here, given our students. We don't have exact numbers. The university doesn't ask. It allows students as freshmen to declare what their religious tradition is, doesn't require them to. And so we don't have exact counts of, what's the religious make of our student. The typical best guess, and you know this better than I do in campus ministry, is something like about half, 40% being Catholic, other kinds of Christian, but significant numbers of, Muslim students, Jewish students, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist sort of students. And so it's that literal dialogue of life. It's talking to your friends about what do they do and why they do this. And at the university, it's the chance to really learn this. And I love this about the Jesuit university here, because they don't require chapel. They don't force you to go to church or anything like that. But this idea that you need to learn about religion, you need to learn about theology, you don't have to be religious to know that this is incredibly diverse and you want to learn about some of this. How do you deal with this? What do you do, if your boyfriend is Jewish or your girlfriend is Hindu or there's a Buddhist temple on your your street, or your dad's boss is Jewish and dies, and how do you deal with that loss? What do you do? And I think those are the ways in which we get that real kind of dialogue. And I say that as someone who teaches literally a comparative theology class. That's much more important than anything that I do in that classroom.
Yeah, I certainly would concur with everything you said. You and I have talked about perhaps LMU becoming a center for Muslim Catholic dialogue here within the Archdiocese, and I'm certainly open and desirous of exploring that with you. But I think it has to be even at a lower level, a younger level. I remember I'm on the board of one of our Catholic girls' schools, high school, and the principal, because not all the little darlings in our schools, our Catholic schools, are Catholic, okay? This is an all-girls school where I'm the board. Some of the girls there are Muslim. And the principal sent out a notice during Ramadan to the teachers not to be very strict about the young ladies who may be fasting and be all day, they not be able to have the attention span in class that they might otherwise have had. Which I thought was a wonderful gesture on her part, and a sensitivity to the religious obligations of others. And I remember also helping one of our elementary schools celebrate the diversity of religions within that elementary school. I remember bringing Buddhist monks and nuns and Hindu swamis and all these people in the saffron robes. Those little kids couldn't get enough of touching that saffron robe. They couldn't understand, they'd never seen anything like that. And they engaged in conversations with these people. It was a wonderful way of beginning to instill in them the diversity of religious traditions in Los Angeles.
As a product of Catholic high school, I remember you coming and giving talks at Bishop Montgomery once upon a time. And yes, God willing, LMU could become a center for that type of dialogue and model that for the rest of the country. So in Arabic, inshallah, God willing. Inshallah, from your mouth to God's ears. I think we're out about time. It's 9 o'clock, so let's give our panelists a round of applause.